Hi, my name is Cry Bachman, and at Autodesk University 2020, I presented shared coordinates because after all these years, I still don't get it. If you haven't seen that video, I will include a link in this video above or in the description down below. I recommend watching that video first because this is actually part 2. You see, with the class recording, I was restricted to 1 hour, and there's certain concepts I couldn't fit into that time. So this is a bonus video that'll cover a couple more concepts that I still think are important to know. Okay, now one quick thing that I wanted to show you is I mentioned that buildings can remember more than one location. That is, if I wanted to have building B repeat itself, say back here, I could actually record that as a second site. And the other possibility of using this is if you've got a building where you're sitting there going, we don't actually know whether we want the building to sit on the site in this orientation or whether we want it to sit in a 90 degrees rotation. So in this case, I'm just going to do a quick example where we're going to try a second option, but with the same model. Now, before I rotate the model, I want to disengage the shared coordinates because I don't want to update the current positioning of this one, which will overwrite the values of building B on site. But what I want to do is save this as a separate situation or a separate option, a site within the other file. So I'm going to rotate it by 90 degrees. And then I'm going to click on my shared options again. But as you can see, because I've established shared coordinates, it's not going to allow me to acquire or publish. In this case, it's going to allow me to move it back to its original location or record it as a new position. So in this case, I'm going to hit change, and I don't want to modify this current one, but I want to create a second one, and I'm going to call it Building B On-Site Option 2. Because I want to have this second option as a rotated in 90 degrees. Now I'm going to hit OK. Under the properties here, if I expand it out a little, you'll see that it's now at Site 2. If I hit Save, again, it's going to save it back into the other file. Now what this will allow me to do is it allows me to have it linked in, and I can see it at one position, or I can select the second option, or the original option, and it'll rotate it back. So it can actually know two possible locations for the same file, and I can toggle them back and forth between the two. Or if I was doing an instance where I had this copied over here, I could have one model set to one site and one model set to the second. Now, before we move on, I should probably clarify where Revit is actually saving the site information. You see, up at the top here, within each model, you have a Locations tab. And a lot of people, when they see the map on the first tab, they think that this has something to do with shared coordinates. This is used for other pieces of information, such as shadow studies and doing energy modeling, but it's not actually the sites for shared coordinates. Those are stored under the site location down here at the end. Now you'll remember that I said you shouldn't leave this called internal, which is referring to the Revit internal. So the other thing you should do is go into your main site file and rename it so that it doesn't say internal, but it is actually referred to as something else. In this case, I'm going to call this Wales location, as this one is in the real world location up in Wales. But remember, use something that's relevant to your project, such as your project name or project number. Now, anytime you link the site file into the other files, it'll actually come in with that name as its shared coordinate name, not project internal. Now, the last thing I want to show you is what happens when we start to link the site file into building B. However, before we do that, you might need to do a bit of geometry inside the site file, such as tracing the property line around the property, because otherwise you won't have anything to reference in because the DWG won't come through. So make sure you add in a bit of geometry first, something that's very recognizable like the property line, and then save and close out of this file and open up building B. So here I am within building B, and in this case I want to reference in my site around the file, I'm going to simply link in my site file by shared coordinates because the two files have already done a handshake. And as I mentioned, I added a property line around. Now you'll notice it comes in off to the side initially, but once you hit this close, it'll jump right into place. So you can see that the site file references right in here. Now, in this case, I might want to do some work with coordinating building B and building A together. So let's bring in the architectural for building A as well. By shared coordinates, again, the two files have done a handshake, and this one has that 5-degree angle to the property line. So lastly, what I want to show you is what happens to those sites that I created earlier. I had two different options set up. So if I go up here and go to my location tab, you can see that I can go under my site and I've got two. It says that the top one is the current one, and that would make sense. This was the first one that I established within the file. But I can easily pick the second one and say make current and hit OK. And what it'll do is it'll actually rotate my entire site around, allowing it to align in the way that it did once I rotated it 90 degrees. So this is the same functionality that you'll see if you have the same file linked in multiple times. It'll shuffle all the other linked files around it and moving it left or right until it gets into the right position. But what's important to understand is that building B is still sitting in the same position it was always, right by the Revit origin, and that it's actually just moving all the other models around it. Pretty cool, eh?